Hey everyone, it's Miss Ryan here. This is number 4 from the 2019 free response exam, no calculator section. We have the barrel with a diameter of 2 feet. Water is being collected. Let me just read this. A cylindrical barrel with a diameter of 2 feet contains collected rainwater as shown in the figure. The water drains out through a valve not shown at the bottom of the barrel. The rate of change of the height of the water in the barrel with respect to time is modeled by dH/dt equals -1/10 square root of h, where h is measured in feet and time is measured in seconds. And they give you the formula for the volume of a cylinder. Part C is a question that you can do. It says at time 0 seconds, the height of the water is 5 feet. Use separation of variables to find an expression for h in terms of t. This would be a great time to pause and think about how you're going to solve this problem. All right, so they say to use separation of variables, and that's a really good hint for you. And this is going to be, this is a differential equation. It's an equation with a derivative in it. And they want you to solve the differential equation and to end up with an equation for h equals something in terms of t. So separation of variables is when we separate the variables so that the h is with the dh, and if there were any t's, that they would be with dt. Anytime you want to pause and try these steps on your own, if you want to pause now and try to separate the variables, you could go ahead. So if you multiply both sides by dt, you would actually just be one step away from separating the variables. If you'd like to pause and think about what is that one step to separate the variables, go ahead. And it is dividing by the square root of h. If you divide by the square root of h, your variables are separated. And you have the square root of h with the dh, and then the constant -1/10 with the dt. So that's actually your first point if you were able to do that. And you can feel free to pause and think about what the next step would be. The next step is to find the antiderivatives. And it would probably help if you make the square root of h to the 1/2. It would also help if you move it to the top. So square root of h is the same thing as h to the 1/2. You can move it to the top and make it a -1/2. And then the second point is going to be if you can get these antiderivatives. So first you would be adding 1, or 2/2, and that gives us 1/2. You also have to divide by the new exponent. So after you add 1, you have to divide by the new exponent, and dividing by 1/2 is the same as multiplying by 2. So there's your antiderivative there. The antiderivative of -1/10 is -1/10t plus your constant. Very similar to like if you had a constant of 5, the antiderivative is 5t. Antiderivative of 6 is 6t. -1/10 is a constant, so that would be -1/10t. You could also think of an imaginary t to the 0 there because that's equal to 1, and you could add 1 to get t to the first, and then dividing by the new exponent, dividing by 1 isn't going to change that constant. So that's another way to get it. So that is your second point. The third point is going to be figuring out what the constant is. And on this question, they told you at time 0, the height is 5. So that is the part that we are going to, that's our initial condition. So it says the height is 5. So that is our h. And it says time is 0. So we're plugging in that initial condition, that's going to go away. And you have 2, 5 to the 1/2 is your constant. I definitely prefer to write that in this way. That 5 to the 1/2 is the same as the square root of 5. So that constant, that's your third point on this question. Then we're going to be going back to this where we left off. And I'm just going to zoom out a tiny bit so that we can take that equation and plug in our constant. So we've got 2, I'm going to write square root of h if that's okay, instead of h to the 1/2, negative 1 over 10t plus our constant of 2 root 5. Okay, and then as is pretty normal in these questions, the very last point has a number of steps. Not too many in this, actually. It's only 2 steps, but the last point is just being able to get h by itself. You go back to the original question and wants an expression for h in terms of t, so they want you to get h by itself. And this is another time it would be great to pause if you want to try to isolate h. So I'm going to do a little bit of an ugly solution first. And I'm just going to leave it as a complex fraction. I have a fraction within a fraction, and I'm going to just leave it because this is free response and I am allowed to do that. So I'm going to just leave it as divided by 2. And you only have one more step. The last step to get h alone, you probably know this, is to square both sides. Okay, and the square root of h squared is going to just be h equals, and then you've got negative 1 over 10t plus 2 root 5 divided by 2 being squared. And that would be the 4th point. And I'm going to come back in a second and show if you don't want to write it in that ugly way, I'll come back for those people in 1 second. The rubric, we don't need to look at all these steps, but I was narrating this as I went. Separation of variables was your first point. Getting the antiderivative, that was your second point. Getting your constant was your third point. And then the last point is if you were able to solve for h. So that was a 4-point question. If you are happy with this answer, you can stop the video right here. I'm just going to go back and show, not doing that divided by 2. So I'm going to go back to this 2 root h equals, and then it was negative 1 over 10t plus 2 root 5. Okay, so if you didn't want to do that divided by 2, you could multiply by 1/2, which is the same thing. It's going to cancel out that 2, and then that 1/2 is going to distribute to both. If you prefer to write it in the front, that's totally fine too. Like that. So it's going to distribute to both. So this is going to become negative 1 over 20t, and then these 2's would actually cancel out, so it'd be root 5. So negative 1 over 20t, and then the 2 on top and the 2 on bottom cancel, and you have root 5, and then you would just square as your last step. So that's really the only difference. Negative 1 over 20t plus root 5 being squared. And you can see that the rubric listed that as the answer, although the other form would have been completely fine because it's free response and you don't have to simplify, and you all know that. So that is the differential equation. Haven't seen that in a while. And the last part of that question.